Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And there's a lot of news to get to this morning. Joining us is Ann Gearan, White House correspondent for The Washington Post. Good morning, Ann.
Hi, Jonathan. Nice to be with you.
All right, let's talk about what happened between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza. The ceasefire that was announced yesterday and that seems to be holding. How much of an impact did President Biden have on achieving this ceasefire?
Well, according to the White House, the whole administration had a considerable impact over more than 80 contacts, starting with Biden directly to Netanyahu. They had 6 phone calls. That's a lot in 10 days, but also extending to the Secretaries of State and Defense, the National Security Advisor, and others as well. Really, the breadth of the U.S. national security leadership talking directly to the Israeli national security leadership in increasingly blunt terms about what the traffic would bear here in the United States and what Israel was getting done on the ground in Gaza.
So what changed in the 11 days? Because there were calls for a ceasefire kind of early on, and the administration and the president wouldn't go there. But I think, as you just said, as the days went on, the president and the administration started turning the screws. Was there anything that changed in the calculus or the analysis in the White House?
Well, there are a couple of things that changed, and starting with the fact that the Israelis were running down their list of Hamas targets in Gaza, and so there was less and less for them to do militarily, and keeping the U.S. pretty closely informed of what they were actually doing. So, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, for example, had a pretty good idea of what the Israelis still had left in front of them that they wanted to accomplish. So that's one thing. The other thing is the political ground in the United States, which we really saw in this conflict, unlike in previous Israeli-Hamas conflicts in Gaza. We saw a difference in the way Democrats reacted and quite critically of Israel and across a broader spectrum of the Democratic Party than we had seen in past conflicts. You could see the difference in the way the president reacted between his first statement, which was all about Israel's right to defend itself, to the last readout that the White House put out when Biden basically gave Netanyahu a deadline, which did not include that previously wrote language. Sounds like a small thing, but it was pretty big, pretty widely noticed that Biden was not saying Israel had right off the bat that Israel had a right to defend itself, and was saying that Israel needed to wind down the conflict on Wednesday.
And talk more about the internal political dynamics for President Biden, because as you point out, the way he has responded is unlike other presidents to my memory.
Well, I mean, it started out like other presidents and got not like other presidents, I think is one way to look at it. I mean, Joe Biden himself is a product of the very traditional bipartisan support for Israel going back decades. And his initial reaction to this meshed with that perfectly. That is the way he has grown up politically to think of Israel as America's closest ally in the Middle East, the only true democracy in the Middle East, and our closest military partner in that part of the world. That certainly is our closest one that's a democracy. And the special relationship that the United States has with Israel is something that he personally that has been very important to him personally. He has also known Netanyahu himself for 40 years. But he also knows Bob Menendez and knows other Democrats who started to sing a different tune over the last week. And that really struck members of the Biden administration and the president himself directly. And that's the message that he began to convey to Netanyahu in a couple of calls earlier this week, most especially on Wednesday.
Let's talk more, and I'm glad you brought up the fact that President Biden is no stranger to the conflict in the Middle East. No stranger to Benjamin Netanyahu. The vice president was the chair of Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. He was vice president for 8 years. He's known Prime Minister Netanyahu for a long time. And so, oh, and one other thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, it took a while for President Biden to take a call with Netanyahu after his election. What does that say about the dynamic of their relationship?
Yeah, it was an unexpectedly long time. So I think, if I recall, it was 5 weeks before they had a phone call. He really kept Netanyahu twiddling his thumbs, and it was completely intentional on Biden's part. The signal that the White House was trying to send was that they wanted to have a different kind of relationship going forward, not one that was any less of a firm alliance, but definitely one that was different than Netanyahu had enjoyed under former President Trump, when Netanyahu bragged quite often that he had an open line to the Oval Office, and he pointed to things domestically in Israel that he said Trump had given him, various political gifts. The Biden administration wanted to put a stop to that, and really made it clear to Netanyahu early on that they were going to reset this relationship back to the way it was, really in many ways under the Obama administration.
And so there's no risk at all that the relationship between the United States and Israel, even with the sort of the tensions between Netanyahu and President Biden, the relationship itself between the two nations, there's no change.
No, there isn't. Certainly there's no official change,
Right.
nor is there likely to be one. But I think the thing to watch is how much sway the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and increasingly more moderate voices like Menendez as well, will have going forward. I mean, right now there's a fight over a round of arms sales to Israel. We're going to keep having fights like that, and the voices that are saying that the United States should change its relationship with Israel, and its presumption, the political presumption that Israel is in the right, those voices are growing louder.
Those arms sales that you're talking about, it's $735 million in arms sales to Israel that New York Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, she's drafted a resolution to try to block it. What's the likelihood of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's resolution actually passing?
I don't think there's a great likelihood of it, but I could be wrong.
And one last quick question, and this gets back to the ceasefire, and that is this. From what I understand, Prime Minister Netanyahu, when talking about the ceasefire, either called it the Egyptian ceasefire or gave a lot of credit to Egypt. Was that a slight to President Biden and the United States, or was it a reflection of what's actually happening on the ground?
Yeah, it's really more the latter, and it was also a recognition that Israel was playing a role that it has played in past conflicts, sort of going back to the regular way that the United States, Israel, and Egypt have dealt with previous outbreaks of violence and previous rounds of airstrikes in Gaza. President Biden as well gave great credit to the Egyptians in his statement last night, and this also represented for him his greatest engagement with Egypt's leader since he became president. In addition to holding Netanyahu at arm's length early on, Biden had also held El-Sisi, the Egyptian leader, somewhat at arm's length, and that you were really seeing that change during this conflict, where there was daily, hourly contact among all three governments.
I want to keep you for one more minute here, and your use of the phrase "arm's length." Am I correct in thinking that the Biden administration had been trying to keep that conflict that was happening in Israel and Gaza at arm's length, not diving in, not wanting to, quote unquote, own the situation there?
Well, yes, you're right, but it's even bigger than the Gaza context. The Biden administration came into office hopeful, if not determined, to keep the entire issue of Middle East peace, on the back burner. Certainly was not something that they intended to try to deal with early on. I mean, unlike other presidents who take office with grandiose statements about, going after the greatest brass ring, like Trump did, or even, speaking in terms like Bill Clinton did about trying to do the right thing in the Middle East, using America's unique power. I didn't hear any of that from Biden, and this is a guy who knows the entire landscape. Instead, they wanted to focus on domestic priorities and the pandemic and leave this for another day. Unfortunately for them, that is not what happened.
And Gearan, White House correspondent for the Washington Post, thank you very, very much for coming to First Look and hanging around about a minute overtime. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Now let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Deputy Editorial Page Editor Ruth Marcus and columnist Megan McArdle. Thank you both very much for coming back to First Look. Great to see you again. Ruth, I will start with you and get your assessment of President Biden and the Biden administration's work and their actions when it comes to brokering that ceasefire in Israel and between Israel and Gaza.
Well, Anne is totally correct that this was not a to-do item on the very long to-do list of President Biden's early agenda, but it's a reminder of the harsh reality that there's no way to address the Mideast without solving, and solving is a big, big struggle, the Palestinian question. I was, as we were talking about, as you and Ann were talking about President Clinton's approach and President Trump's approach, I was reminded, I was on the South Lawn of the White House in 1993, I think it was, when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat had this very brokered handshake over a set of accords that were going to lay out a path for peace. And the realities on the ground are so much more difficult now, thanks in large part to the actions of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So that even if President Biden wanted to put this on his to-do list, he would have a hard time getting anywhere near the prospects for a resolution that President Clinton had. At the same time, President Trump seemed to believe that you could simply ignore the Israeli-Palestinian question and broker a larger Middle East peace with what he called the Abraham Accords. That what we've gone through in the last 11 horrific days just shows that that's completely not feasible. And I'm very glad there is a ceasefire, but ceasefire doesn't mean the end of the problem. It just means it's just a reminder that this problem is persisting.
Right, and this problem, I remember, Ruth, in 1993 being at a dinner in New York in the waning days of the Clinton administration, and President Clinton was the featured speaker, and he talked a long time, even draped himself over the podium, talking about he's using every last minute of his administration to try to broker a deal, to get a deal done, and as we know, he failed at that. Megan, your view about what we just witnessed over the last 11 days and the ceasefire that the president announced last night?
I think that we have to look at Israeli politics as well as American politics, and I think that those have shifted radically. And one thing that I think is really different from the days of the 90s, the days of hope, I think that we all experienced, I wasn't a journalist then, but I was certainly watching it, is that in Israel, the liberal left has collapsed. The people who thought that there was a possibility of peace basically were destroyed by the Oslo process, and now basically have virtually no voice in politics, in part because of that failure. And so while Americans still think about solving the Israeli peace process, they think about trying to get a deal where the Palestinians get something and the Israelis get something and no one's quite happy. That's not really how the Israelis are thinking about it now. They think about managing it. They're not thinking about how do I broker some sort of long-term stable peace. They're just thinking about day-to-day, can I contain the threat of violence from the Palestinians? And that is from their perspective, because of the Second Intifada. Obviously, I think there is a Palestinian perspective that this does not weight heavily enough, but that is the reality of politics on the ground in Israel, and it makes the whole process very difficult. And I think, one thing that the Trump administration had basically kind of decided was that they weren't going to try to solve it. Instead, they were going to manage it, right? Or another way to put it is, they were going to pick a winner. They were going to go in, basically take Israel's side, tell the Palestinians, here's some money if you want it, take it or leave it, but we're not going to try to make a deal that you are going to walk away feeling vindicated as a people. I don't think that was the morally correct approach, certainly, but it was, I think, in some ways, at least promised a decisive outcome, which managing it doesn't. And managing it is unsatisfying politically, but I think that at this point, that really may be the best that we can do, given the political facts in Israel.
So then, Megan, given what you just said, then I kept, as listening to your answer, the question I'm about to ask you is, does that mean the two-state solution, it's dead? It's never going to happen. You can't have a two-state solution and, as you say, manage the situation. Or am I not reading this right?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of problems. The first is that the Palestinian Authority doesn't have the state capacity to run a state. Functionally, if you look at how weak they are at just controlling violence within their own borders, kind of the first basic thing that governments do before we talk about all the wonderful stuff with social services and all the rest of it, is just, can you control violence within your own borders? They have weak state capacity. Obviously, Gaza is controlled by Hamas, not by the Palestinian Authority, which just tells you how little state capacity there is there. So that is one problem. And again, this is not like there's some inherent and intrinsic characteristic of Palestinians. This has a lot to do with the occupation itself, but it is nonetheless a reality on the ground. Also, I think, younger Palestinians are moving towards a one-state solution. And that is obviously completely off the table for younger Israelis. And you also have to look, one thing that I think is really interesting and under-discussed in America is the demographic shift in Israel, where, during Oslo, we were largely dealing with a kind of European-descended population. There was obviously a significant Sephardic population, which is Middle Eastern Jews. But, you were negotiating with people who kind of had a personal and cultural memory of the Holocaust. This was incredibly dominant for them, and that inflected negotiations in a bunch of ways. Since then, you've had a big influx of Russian Jews and of Sephardim from other Middle Eastern countries who don't view the Holocaust as kind of essential to their Jewish identity in the way that those Eastern European and obviously, German, French, etc., Jews did. And that has changed the character of Israel and how it views a lot of these questions. And also has made them, frankly, I think, just kind of less friendly to the old liberal Zionist dream of an integrated two-state solution, both peoples living peacefully side by side. They're just less impressed by that argument. And that has really changed the character of these debates as well.
Wow, that you just gave me an incredible education there, Megan. Ruth, I would give you a chance to jump in here if you have more thoughts to add, and also to my question about a two-state solution, should we just give up on the idea?
No is the short answer, but the longer answer is that we shouldn't give up because the status quo is insupportable, unacceptable. A one-state solution is not a solution, it's a disaster. But the sad realities are that a two-state solution, because of a number of things, some of which Megan talked about, because of Netanyahu's actions over the last decades in creating facts on the ground in the form of settlements and other changes, is increasingly unattainable. But without it, I have a hard time seeing an acceptable future. and I think I'm not the only one there. It's funny. I remember being at dinner early on in the since we're all telling old war stories in the Clinton administration with a senior official who confidently predicted that Netanyahu would be gone within 6 months. He wasn't. This official is gone, but Netanyahu remains, and not to the good of Israel. The one other thing that I would say is Megan made very interesting points about the shifting politics of Israel and relatedly the shifting demographics of Israel. I think that the point that you and Ann touched on earlier about the shifting politics of America, the shifting politics of the Democratic Party, to some extent, the shifting attitudes even within the American Jewish community, generational differences, among other things, create a different set of challenges for Israel in terms of this essential relationship it has with America. That relationship is going to endure, but it is not going to be, I think, in the future as unwavering and as unquestioning as it has been at some times in the past.
I want to talk about the January 6th commission, but I have to ask one more question, and that is this. And whoever wants to answer it, I know I shouldn't do this, but whoever wants to answer it, jump in fast. One of the things that I found fascinating and troubling within Israel was sort of the fighting between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, people who were living together side by side, suddenly fighting each other. What does that say about either the future of a two-state solution or this idea of a one-state solution?
I think
It's go ahead, Megan.
Well, I was going to say, I just think that in general, the last few years have kind of revealed that in somewhat the way we learned with Yugoslavia, right, that these ethnic tensions can just boil over at any moment, and relationships you think have managed turn out to be much more fraught and less, knitted together than you thought or hoped. And I think that is a lesson here. And I think I actually also just want to add that, something I think I didn't mention as much as I should have is, yes, that Israel has created a lot of facts on the ground in terms of settlements, which also make a two-state solution extremely difficult, even though I think that would have been, and hopefully someday again, will be the optimal solution.
Ruth.
Let's talk about January 6th. I want to.
Okay, great. So Ruth, it passed. The commission passed out of the House with, I think, 35 Republicans who voted yes, and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican, said, "We don't need it. I'm not voting for it." Is it dead?
Probably in this form, I really hope not. I was trying to figure out how to reconcile the Senator McConnell who talked about the president's role in fomenting the insurrection with the Senator McConnell who doesn't think we need to figure out precisely what happened here, how the chamber that he supposedly reveres so much was desecrated by a mob trying to overturn, in essence, the constitutional order. It is so important for us to get to the bottom of what happened at the Pentagon, what happened with summoning the National Guard, what was going on at the White House, what was the conversation, for example, between Kevin McCarthy and President Trump. The notion that we should somehow feel a sense of relief that 35 House Republicans went along with supporting this deal. And let's just remember, I'm a little worked up about this, by the way. Let's remember, this was a compromise deal. This wasn't a Democratic edict that was pushed through. It was a deal that was brokered by the chairman and ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. It was a compromise that the rug was then pulled out from the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. What a surprise, because President Trump can't brook any examination into his conduct. The notion that we should be somehow relieved that there were a robust 35 Republican members of the House willing to support this is probably correct, that we should be relieved, but it's a measure of what a terrible state the Republican Party is in and how much it is enthralled to the former guy.
So, Megan, I want your views on this, but in responding, why won't Republicans support this commission? And particularly, I'm wondering what happened to some of these senators who voted to convict um, Donald Trump during his second impeachment, but who then voted, I'm thinking of Senator Burr, who voted against, or say they're coming out against this commission.
So, speaking of people who are attempting to manage their intractable problem rather than solve it, the Republican Party, number one on the list, right? The Republicans have a really big problem. Donald Trump is not well liked. I think his prospects for actually winning the presidency in 2024 are pretty dim. But his prospects for winning the nomination in 2024 are not bad at all, because there is a portion of the Republican base that is just absolutely joined to him at the hip. They are determined not to revisit or reassess their decision to vote for him in 2016 or to support him throughout. And that makes this incredibly difficult. Had the Republican Party been able to just decisively repudiate him after January 6th, they would now be in a position where, yeah, sure, you can get some, you would try to manage the commission process in order to kind of minimize the contribution that Republican enablers made and maximize the perfidy of Donald Trump himself. But that's not the direction the party went in. And now we are at a place where it's not that they support him. They don't want him around. They all want him gone. They would be very happy if he moved to Mallorca and spent the rest of his life on a beach just contemplating, Proust, or whatever, whatever one can imagine he would read on the beach.
I mean, that's very fanciful.
Right. But the point is that they don't, it's not that any of them have any desire to see him run again, but they can't figure out how to get rid of him. And so instead what they're trying to do is minimize the discussion of what happened on January 6th, because they can neither repudiate him nor do they really wish to embrace him. It's just an embarrassment and they want it to end. And this is what you saw with Liz Cheney. And this is now again what we are seeing here.
Sorry, Ruth, how much of this is also Republicans like Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy not wanting to have to testify under oath about what he saw, what happened, that phone call that he had with then President Trump, where he was pleading, hey, folks are overrunning this place. And Donald Trump saying to him, well, Kevin, there you seem to be more upset about the election than you are.
Yeah, well, I don't think that Kevin McCarthy is exactly eager to be testifying, whether it's under oath or not. But I think that and that's true probably of a number of people. But the reality is that that's the least of the things of concern here. Sure, people don't want to be put in the position of going directly up against Donald Trump, because we know in this Republican Party who wins there. But the broader problem is the fecklessness, the cowardice. I'm sure if you gave me a few more minutes, I could come up with some other really mean words, and I'm full of them. Of this Republican Party, not in terms of standing up to Donald Trump, but more important in terms of standing up for democracy, because that's what was at issue on January 6th. And if we think that we don't need to look back at January 6th, then we aren't looking at what has happened since then. We aren't looking at the efforts in Georgia and other states to pass laws that oust some of the either impartial or responsible decision makers from overseeing elections and allow state legislatures and other partisan actors to be more involved in certifying or overturning or decertifying the results of elections. We aren't paying attention to this embarrassment, this travesty, this parody of an audit that's going on in Arizona, where we're still relitigating the results of the election that happened 6 months ago. And we are not thinking forward to January 2025, when a different House and a different set of state legislators and state election officials could well it's not impossible at all or fanciful to imagine reach a different and less small d democratic result than the result that we had on January 6, 2021. The stakes are really high.
One word answer, because we are actually over time. If the actual January 6th commission goes down in a ball of flames in the Senate, should Speaker Pelosi set up a select committee to investigate what happened on January 6th? Ruth, yes or no?
Yes, one that's as fair and balanced, to use that phrase, as possible.
Megan McArdle?
Yes, but the political cost may be high and it may sow more division than it solves.
With that, we're going to have to leave it there. Ruth Marcus, Megan McArdle, thank you very much for coming back to First Look. Have a great weekend.
You too, Jonathan, but write that column for me too.
Oh, it's almost done. It's almost done. I just have to do a second read, come up with a headline and all that. Thanks. Have a great weekend. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Come back at noon Eastern. My colleague Heather Long will interview President and CEO of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, Patrick Harker. And then at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, I'll talk with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison about the calls for racial justice and police reform 1 year after the murder of George Floyd. Join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on PBS. Check your local listings. And then on Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern for the Sunday Show on MSNBC. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for tuning in to First Look.